Welcome back to the KDPG Sunday edition. This morning we are talking with the U.S. Attorney for Western Pennsylvania, Scott Brady, about the indictments handed down this past week against 7 Russians who are accused of hacking or attempting to hack at least into the Cranberry-based Westinghouse Corporation, and also with the some incidents dealing with International Olympics. Mr. Brady, I don't want to spend much time on the Olympics, but in the indictments that are handed down, I believe it states that 1 or 2 or several of these individuals traveled to an Olympic site to try to hack into a Canadian official's computer, if I've got all of this correct. And you were able to identify that these agents, which I'm going to call from the GRU, went to this Olympic site. In the Westinghouse case, did those agents attempt to come to Pittsburgh, do you know?
What we allege is that it was done from a remote location. So what we saw from the GRU and these 2 units, they had a remote site team that would do the building of the infrastructure to attempt the hacks. So they would create spoof domains, fake domains. They would launch spear phishing attacks. They would do SQL injections and DDoS attacks. They would build the external pressure on systems to try to find vulnerabilities and try to exploit those. When those were unsuccessful, they launched an on-site or a close access team. And so we saw that in Rio, we saw that in Lausanne, we saw that in The Hague, where they were unsuccessful in their remote penetration attempts. And so that team would be sent, in immediate temporal proximity to those locations to try to exploit other potential vulnerabilities, including, including hotel Wi-Fi.
So I was just going to say that part, that I believe in the indictment that they, in The Hague, they put a car close to the hotel to try to intercept through communications through the Wi-Fi. Is that right? And if they were unsuccessful, and that's the approach they used there, if they were unsuccessful in Cranberry, did they attempt that same sort of activity here in the Pittsburgh area?
Well, what we saw in Rio and Lausanne was the exploitation of hotel Wi-Fi to compromise systems. And unwitting travelers sometimes use hotel Wi-Fi, and they do that with their work computers. They try to access, they access their work email, which then connects back to work servers. So if you're able to penetrate those laptops and those email accounts, which they did in Rio and in Lausanne, they were then able to go back to the anti-doping networks, so WADA and USADA and CSIS specifically, and then get into, and that's how, at least in that part of the investigation, that part of the charge, they stole the most private and sensitive medical information of international athletes from around the world, which is then posted as part of their disinformation campaign on fancybear.net.
So quite apart from the astonishing revelation that spear phishing is an Olympic sport, what value really is that information to them?
Well, it depends on the target.
Were they trying to disrupt the anti-doping thing, or they just wanted to get the information to mortify some people?
It appears that part of their disinformation campaign was to either falsely accuse other countries of engaging in the same kind of state-sponsored conduct that Russia had been exposed in conducting. In some cases, I think they wanted it for strategic value. For example, when the attempted hack of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in The Hague, that was the lab, and then the Spiez lab in Switzerland were the labs that were conducting the testing of potential chemical weapon use in Syria and the poisoning of a GRU official and his daughter in the UK. So I think it really depends on the target, but sometimes it was disinformation, sometimes it was to publish and expose and just embarrass other national sports federations or athletes by posting their most sensitive information.
But they weren't trying, for example, to change the results or anything like that, or to hack into and adjust the results of any of these tests?
To our knowledge, they were not. Yeah. To our knowledge, they were...
I don't want to give them any ideas, of course.
Right. They were pulling information which they would then publish. Sometimes they would alter it, and that's alleged in the indictment as well. But I think they also, in certain instances, wanted to understand, for example, with the Court of Arbitration for Sport, they wanted to understand where there were arbitrations. Perhaps there were decisions coming down that they wanted to be aware of. Again, I don't want to speculate, but I think it's fair to say, based on the target, that their strategic interest in that was different.
So if they're hacking into all of the Westinghouse and trying to hack into Westinghouse and sports anti-doping stuff, is any information vulnerable right now?
Well, I think everyone's...
every
Right. I think everyone's information has certain vulnerabilities, right? And corporations are working very, very aggressively to shore up all of their defenses, and there are a lot of strategies. I won't go into those.
But who's ahead? Who's ahead in this game?
Well, I think it's a constantly evolving landscape. And so when there are protections put in place, this is, again, a dynamic and changing both landscape, and the paradigm of this activity is changing from nation-state involvement, as we discussed, but to blended involvement, where nation-states are now engaging criminal syndicates, cyber syndicates, to do some of the criminal activity, but being paid by nation-states.
I mean, we talked about Westinghouse, et cetera, but the banks have been hit hard also. Is that right?
Banks are one of the major targets in these kinds of cyber attacks.
And who normally goes after the banks?
Well, I think you see both, again, individual hackers. Sometimes it might be hacktivists that have a political or ideological agenda that they want to further.
I'm going back, Mr. Brady, to a time, I think a couple of years ago, when I think even PNC and there were some other banks were just hit hard. I mean, it was a constant attempt to try to get into their systems. According to PNC and the other banks, they were able to stop it. They were not hacked into. But that's not some guy sitting in his hotel room or, I mean, in his basement somewhere doing this. This is state-sponsored terrorism, and so my question is cyber terrorism. So my question is there a particular country that leads the way in trying to hack into U.S. companies?
Well, I think we've seen from public statements from General Sessions, from Christopher Wray, the FBI director, and certainly yesterday or this week from Vice President Pence, China is our most significant cyber threat long term.
Bigger than Russia?
Bigger than Russia.
Have you read President Clinton's and James Patterson's novel about this very subject?
No, I haven't.
It's quite good, and it talks about the ultimate vulnerability of the country, the electric grid. I mean, should we be very worried?
Well, I know that we have men and women that are standing on the wall protecting us. So I think we can take solace in that. We have our very best minds and the most capable people combined with cutting edge technology to protect us from that. And where we partner with the private sector, then we're made stronger.
Part of the situation that we find out with China and U.S. companies is that Chinese will be hired by these companies. This is not necessarily an attack as much as pilfering of the information of someone who is employed there. Do they just go hand in hand, or are they two separate investigations that go on in this sort of thing?
I think there's a broad spectrum of activity that China and other state actors are engaged in. And it's from kind of cyber hacking to counterintelligence, counter-espionage type work where they either recruit people within companies, where they send people over under the guise of research grants. We see all of that activity going on.
And the line between private and government in China and to some extent in Russia is not very, it's fuzzier than it is here.
That's absolutely right. Because what we see is if you want to do business in China, in some industries, you have to enter into a joint venture with the Chinese.
Or maybe even with the Chinese army.
Right, that's 51% owned or controlled by the Chinese. We see China now exporting that same model to the United States, where they are purchasing companies and very aggressively moving into our economic infrastructure.
We want to get into two other areas here very quickly because we don't have a lot of time left. I have a feeling I know what your answer is. What can you tell us about this individual and the upcoming midterm elections and possible hacking into U.S. elections?
I can say that it is an area of concern, not with respect to the individuals named in this indictment, but for any kind of state actor interference in elections, we are deeply concerned and watching for that. Vice President Pence highlighted possible Chinese attempts at election interference this week in his speech, and so it's something that we care very deeply about and are working
Some of that
against.
work is being done in Pittsburgh, do you think?
I can't comment on exactly what we're doing in that space.
To that end, we only have about a minute left. Pittsburgh, your predecessor, Mr. Hickton, indicated that Pittsburgh is perhaps the center of the cybersecurity investigative unit for the FBI. Is that the case?
I think it is, and I don't think that's just us patting ourselves on our back. I think we do the kind of cases at the level of sophistication that maybe only 2 or 3 U.S. attorneys' offices in the entire country can do.
Does that make us more or less vulnerable?
I don't think it's to our investigative and prosecutorial capability more than our vulnerability. I think our business community is as vulnerable as any other business community across the United States, but when deployed, we have relationships with the private sector, with the academic community here that allows us to do things that and move with an agility that maybe other offices can't.
Would it be safe to say that when we hear of an indictment, say, from a U.S. attorney in California or Minnesota or Texas, and it has to do with cybersecurity, that a lot of that investigation was done here in the Pittsburgh area?
Well, the FBI model of investigation is a little bit different in how they deploy resources. Typically, when a U.S. Attorney's Office brings an indictment, they've done the majority of the work in that case because there's a victim in that district. But again, I can say, starting with Mary Beth Buchanan, continuing under Dave Hickton's leadership, and today, we bring the most sophisticated cyber indictments that, at least in this case, really are paradigm changing, I would argue.
Mr. Brady, thanks so much for being with us this morning on the KDPG Sunday edition. David and I'll be back in just a moment.